Yes, thank you very much for having me. Very happy for this opportunity. Talking to HKUST is always a treat. I consider HKUST to be my home, spent many years there. Uh, yeah, still keep in touch with everybody. So a pleasure, really. I'll today be talking about some of the developments in psychological science and the way that I understand them and took part in them. And then we'll briefly outline the things that I've been doing in the past 4 or 5 years at HKU with my own team, a team that I started and coordinate. And to give you kind of like a general overview of the scope and scale of the things that we try and do. So I think we all are aware that we are facing some major challenges in the world. The last 2 years have been difficult in Hong Kong and beyond, facing the pandemic. But obviously, this is not even the largest challenge that we're facing. All sorts of things are happening in the world. I try and keep track of this, what is happening and to what extent do I have impact on this. Some of the realizations of me being a psychologist, one of the reasons why I chose science is because I want to have an impact. And during the pandemic, I was asking myself, so what do I have to contribute to everything that's going on? Do I have something to offer? And many times when I asked other social psychologists, people in judgment decision making, what do we have to offer? It was not always clear that we have an answer to this. What is clear is that we rely on science in order to address this kind of thing. So never in the history of the world have we've been able to develop vaccines as fast as we have. And a lot of other things like addressing global climate change, global challenges depend on science. So the question is, how can we arrive at a credible, optimized science that is able to address such challenges? Just an example from the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the many papers that started to come out realizing the importance of things like open science. So we have a lot of problems where people don't share with one another, countries don't share with one another, a lot of things are hidden. But if you want to know what is the efficacy of a vaccine, or what kind of an intervention is best for policymakers, let's say in Hong Kong, then we need credible science and we need to move fast. So no longer can we do the 2-3 years of peer review, round one, round two, round three. We need to do things differently. We need to share with one another. We need to learn and arrive at insights very, very fast, but also be very, very careful because there are some implications for getting things wrong. So some of the things you can see here in this slide. So for example, we need open reviews, we need preprints, we need pre-registrations, register reports, all of these things, but these are not enough. We actually need to do a lot better than this. Up until this year, I needed to argue for why we need open science, but gladly this is no longer the case because open science is now a fact. Thankfully, UNESCO decided to come out with a statement in 28th of March this year with a global call for everybody. So now I just need to refer to UNESCO and say UNESCO is saying that this is the case. And suddenly, from me having to promote and try to get people to care about open science, suddenly people are coming to me and saying, UNESCO is saying this is important. Can you tell us what to do? So I think this is a very important development, and I think it has something to do with the pandemic and what we've been experiencing the last 2 years. I will tell you a little bit about my research. I try to summarize this in a way that would be easy to deliver, but generally on the left are my approaches. So I strongly believe in open, transparent science, in doing meta science, looking at things from top level. So evaluating science by scientific means. So that is meta science. And I do believe that in order to address the challenges in both science and society, we do need collaborative science. My domains, the things that I do focus my research on are these main three. On one side, judgment decision making, and then values, morality, and ethics, and then choice and agency. Today, I will mostly focus on the top two. So one of the things I think that is very important when you do a postdoc, especially for me, that I had quite a unique journey, first based in a business school, then moved to social psychology postdocs, and then finally being in psychology, is that you need to sit down with yourself and think what you care about. So in 2015, 16, lots of things happened in social psychology. So that's the time of my postdoc. So I sat down and tried to write for myself, what do I care about? And I really care about trustworthiness. I want to make sure that the things that I do are solid, that they're reproducible, replicable. And I do care about inclusion and equity. So I think hierarchy generally has a problem. We need to include as many stakeholders as possible, including students, including people who we do not think of as generally conducting science. And at the core of open science is, of course, full transparency, sharing everything that you do, not just the materials, the data, and the code, but everything about the process. If you failed to find something, you should report this. If you succeeded at finding something, you should report this. But all the exclusions, all the conditions, all the variables, this is the main thing. But also, in addition to this, some of the other developments in psychological science, in 2016, this seemed like a big risk, but by now we know that these are a fact in social psychology and psychology more broadly. Register reports is one of the things that I'll be talking about, but emphasizing really collaboration and community. So I'll show you a little bit of what I mean by collaboration and community. So just a few days ago, October 27, 28 was the first ever big team science conference, bringing together many babies, many primates, and the psychological science, etc., which I'm proud of and I'll talk about. And I gave one of the first talks over there, talking about the team as an alternative model to some of these other teams over there. And it was just wonderful to see how far we've come in doing large-scale collaborations in psychology. So it used to be only the physicists in CERN, coming together in order to build something in Switzerland, and now psychologists are doing this. It's almost natural. And some of the other sciences, like many primates, biology, are joining in and taking advantage of this method. This is just a very brief overview of some of the amazing projects that were talked about in this conference. Just to sit over there and hear about this was terrific. One of the largest ones is this one, DARPA SCORE. So DARPA in the US, the defense, Army, Navy, the other organizations care about this as well. They want to know what is credible, what is solid in science, and how we could build on that in the future. So collaborating with the Center of Open Science, they're doing thousands of replications and extensions and reproductions, and working together with the Replications projects in order to try and map out the literature systematically and arrive at some insights with prediction markets, with codifying everything in the literature. It's all the things that we should have done long ago or should have been embedded in the process, but now we're doing this post hoc in order to make sure that the foundations that we build our research on are indeed solid. But you can say that it's with everything. Now the economists have these mass scale collaborations where they're trying to replicate things from economics. We have in biology, cancer biology, babies, educational, developmental. And I'll talk about two of those. One is Psychological Science Accelerator, and the other is FORRT, the Framework for Open and Reproducible Research Training. I just want to show you the impact of what they've done in the last 2 years. And we should keep in mind that these were difficult years. These are years where the world was struggling. Many of us struggled to just find the mindset, the free space to think about our situations. And somehow this group of scholars, so you can see all these psychological science accelerators that I took part in, were able to arrive at some amazing publications in some of our most reputable journals. And it keeps growing all the time. I didn't even imagine that this would have this kind of large scale. At the beginning, I was just yeah, I'll go over some drafts, I'll do some data collection. I didn't even know that this is going to arrive at publications, but you can see the impact of this team. It's a real, it's a humbling experience to be part of this team and see how they work and see the impact that they're having. So the original publication came out 2018 or so. You can see the number of collaborators where they're trying to say, we need to work together, like CERN, CERN for psychological science. So initially in 2018, this was 1,300 members from 84 countries, 6 continents. We've never done something on this scale before. We don't even know how to coordinate and fund something like this. And what is even more remarkable is that if you look at this, most of the people involved here are early career researchers. These are mostly students, PhD students. Some of them are now postdocs with zero funding till now they're struggling to get funding. So when this kind of community comes together, you really realize that the way that we think about science, there is something that is fundamentally flawed that could be easily improved if we just decide to put our minds into it. So I'll give very, very quickly, briefly, some of the examples. So you can see over here, the team decided to come together and look at how do we address COVID-19 better. So you can see once again the large sample, so 20,000 people from 87 countries from around the world, looking at how we can increase the positive emotions and decrease the negative emotions. And you can see that across the world from many places, they did an intervention. You can see how many in each, there's a control condition, and there's two ways to try and intervene in order to address this. And they came to some wonderful findings that really can help address reduce anxiety and depression in people from around the world in various countries. This is another one looking at how do we get people to socially distance? How do we get people to do things that are important for us in the community? Obviously, some people have feelings of defiance. You know, if the government tells us one thing, especially in the West, and we're going to do something different, is there a way for us to do things in a way that would get more compliance and people to do this because they want to? How to frame these kinds of messages? So you can see that some of the autonomous motivations are enhanced with some of the interventions and decreasing defiance. So wonderful to see this. If you want to see what that looks like in different countries, so for example, here you can see the breakout in health messaging about loss framing. So what happens when you frame things in a positive way or a negative way? It comes from behavioral economics, judgment, decision-making, prospect theory, kind of related framing effects. And we were hoping to have larger implications for behavioral intentions, but you can see that in some cultures it worked, in some cultures it didn't work, but on the aggregate around the world, the effects are quite small, but there were effects that are generally to the positive side, reducing anxiety almost anywhere around the world, and the aggregate of that is quite a substantial kind of a decrease. So amazing to see that. In addition, looking at morality, so what is moral? How do we establish morality? This becomes increasingly important because we have self-driving autonomous vehicles that are doing trolley dilemma kind of decisions. Do I take action? Who do I, if I have this group against this group, or this group versus that person, who do I emphasize? Who do I choose? And then it seems like there are some cultural differences between the Eastern, the Southern, and the Western. So we need to map out our findings and to see whether these are cross-cultural, whether there's some cultural differences between those. So this is one example of how intent and how personal force come into play when we have moral judgments of harm. If harm happened, how did harm happen? And how can we mitigate some of that? So that was the Psychological Science Accelerator. FORRT is a different thing. FORRT is more based on the educational direction and looking at meta-scientific work. So increasingly in psychological science, we do more of open science replications and extensions. So we want to know what replicates and what doesn't. When I came into HKU, was given a book. Here's the book for social psychology. Please teach this. But as I was flipping through the book, it became very clear that some of these findings just don't replicate very well. Some of those we have doubts about. Some of those we've never replicated before since the 1970s using a Princeton sample. So I wasn't confident that I can base my work on this. But what FORRT tries to do is look at the entire body of literature that the open science, the science reform movement has done in the last few years, and to summarize this. So for example, all the reversals and replications. So if it's in your book, is it solid or not? Really terrific, bringing in a lot of early career researchers to work on this collaboratively. So this is one of the first publications that came out just recently about a glossary. So all the terms, so we mapped out 250 terms in the literature. So what does it mean to have a replication? What is a direct replication? What does it mean to do sharing? Just looking at term by term, trying to define what that is so that we'll all speak the same language. seems like taken for granted, but it really isn't if you look at the literature, and we need somewhere that we can collaboratively go and edit together. So this is kind of my summary to things. Big team science is a revolution in psychological science. We need a large-scale impact. It's already having an impact in our community, and it just keeps growing. If you're not part of this, I don't know why, but there's not that many people in Hong Kong. Please do join this, especially if you're an early career researcher. There's so much to benefit, gain from this, both in terms of the methodology, the way that people work together, finding collaborators, but also in your career, there are some publications that come out of this, and you can be a co-author. And I think the most important thing that I've learned a lot from it has, prompted me to change the way that I teach and do research this year is the relevance to urgent challenges. So COVID-19, we need to have a say about this. Climate change, we need to have a say about this. We need to change the way that we do research in order to have something to contribute to society. There are all kinds of challenges about the way that these mass collaboration attempts work. Psychological science accelerator is revolutionary, but there's still some problems in terms of the bureaucracy, the control and the oversight, the speed. It is speedy, but it still takes some time. Sometimes it seems like it's too large. You need to wait for the slower labs in order to get to the, you can't really verify everything that's done by every single lab. There's an issue of credit. So let's say that I contributed a lot. I am one of 100 co-authors. So how does somebody know what it is that I contributed? It just assumes that we have skills and puts that into the tests rather than building skills. So I wanted to build on all of that and offer a complementary alternative model that looks at everything that I believe in: collaborative science, open science, meta science, and embed this within teaching and mentoring here at HKU. So I wanted to integrate education and research. I wanted to really support the next generation, both early career researchers that have committed to academia, but also students. It's important that they understand what science is, that they engage in science hands-on. So when they evaluate whether they should social distance and take a vaccine, they would know how to go to look at credible evidence rather than following a lot of misinformation. I wanted to focus on singular effects rather than a lot of effects together, impactful classics, revisiting some of those, reproducing and replicating some of those. I wanted to do a systematic mapping of the literature, at least in my domains, in judgment, decision-making, and social psychology. And I wanted to ensure that we do best practices as we know them right now, following the science reform movement about doing registry reports, pre-registrations, well-powered samples within a single homogeneous lab, everything shared, lots of checks and balances, and then learning incrementally from each step along the way. And finally, when we do a lot of those, if it's scalable, then we're able to arrive at some meta-scientific insights. So what is this team that I coordinate? You can see some of that here. It's based on my teaching, the courses that I do at HKU. So by now you can see the number of students that have gone, taken my courses. It's about 360 students altogether across the 4 years. On the right side, you can see my guided thesis students. So I've had the undergraduates and the taught masters that I guided in their thesis. And I'll talk about this in a second, but finally, after we conclude the scientific work in my courses and arrive at a manuscript, I open this up for anybody from around the world to come in and take the lead. And you can see that we have a lot of early career researchers from around the world that have joined us in order to be the lead authors and bring things to publication. So I'll just give you an example from the domain of judgment and decision-making. Typically, when we try and map out what are the cognitive biases, heuristics and biases, behavioral economics, judgment, decision-making, there's some stuff out there in the literature, but it's kind of like based on intuition, gut instincts. This looks close to this, not much evidence base in there. So I took this from Wikipedia. This is what the best that we have right now and what is communicated to practitioners and the public. But I think that we can do better. So we can systematically revisit all the classics that are in there. We can reproduce and recreate things that have been, published in the 1970s and have been lost. Maybe we don't have access to the materials or or the data, rerun all of this using best methods that we have, trying to improve of some of the design. So we've learned something in the last 30, 40 years, so we can definitely revamp some of these things and add some extensions and look at all sorts of links. At the end, we can integrate all of these insights together and reignite interest in some directions that seem stuck but are very relevant to things like pandemic and climate change. So this is an example from like one publication where we mapped out the action-in-action effects. So it seems like there's just so many action-related buzzwords in the judgment and decision-making literature. And there's a question, is like, what is the difference between those? Do those overlap? Are those the same thing? Can we map all of these together based on one principle, one theory? So we have action effect, inaction effect, omission bias, action principle of harm, inaction inertia, action inertia. What are those the same thing or not? And in this review, we try to map this based on the concept of normality. Norm theory, Kahneman and Miller in the 1980s seems to fit the best, but this is just one sort of mapping that we can do if we've done work in all of these domains as our team has done. What have we done so far? So after 4 years, we've done about 80 pre-registered studies. We have ongoing 40 registered report stage 1 studies. We've done about completed 3 pre-registered meta-analysis. We're doing 3 registered report stage 1 meta-analysis. We've conducted prediction markets together with economists in Sweden. And then we wrote a lot of open science collaborative guides and templates that anybody can come, take, use, and implement the same things if they want to build their own team or their own collaboration. In the judgment and decision-making literature, we've mapped out all of these effects, and there's lots of other effects that are pending. So you can say that of the classics, all those that have been impactful, all those that we know have had an impact on the literature, we've at some point in time done a study on this, either a replication extension or a meta-analysis or a novel kind of research. And it's a humbling experience to visit some of the big minds out there and what they've done, learn from their methodology. So I can say that our team has gone through every possible experimental design that you can think of, and I've learned a lot in the process. So what does it mean to integrate education, research, and community? How do we achieve this kind of impact within 4 years? So my traditional view of teaching, this is how I grew up, this is how I was taught, is that there's a professor who knows some stuff, at least in his or her own domain, that is in front of the classroom saying, my truth is, my understanding of the world is like this, and then the students are not engaged, sitting in the back and listening to this. Either they accept this, if they even listen to this, and if they accept this, what do they do with this? Does this really represent the truth or not? I found this to be lacking in a lot of different respects. And some thinkers that are involved in education, or at least trying to guide the way that we should think about science. One of them is Adam Grant, which I have high respect for, has a famous podcast, writes some book. And last year, I read this book or listened to this as an audiobook, and I really like this chapter number 9 that says rewriting the textbook. So rather than teaching students what knowledge is, or what our understanding of knowledge is, or what this book's understanding of knowledge is, we should teach students to question knowledge, have a critical mindset, scientist mindset, what it means to be a scientist, with a lot of humility, rather than accepting things for what they are, learning by doing, so you can have hands-on engagement in conducting scientific studies, where you embrace that reality is messy, confusion is natural, uncertainty is natural, science reflects some of the reality in being messy. Plus, and I think this is really important, that soon students can inform science. Students are not passive receivers of our knowledge. Students can really be part of that community. So in Maastricht University, where I did my postdoc, I was, blew my mind to see that students can do this. You present them with a problem in problem-based learning, and they map out the learning goals, they seek out the information, they bring it back, they discuss this and integrate this, and they come to some conclusions where the professor, sits in the back and just makes sure that the process is flowing well, We weren't even supposed to intervene. If we saw something horribly wrong, we could just suggest an alternative and a realignment rather than telling them you're wrong, this is what you should do. And if you have some concerns about this, I would say that I just thought that this was completely positive. So you're welcome to view the video up there and see how this works in action. So when I came to HKU, I decided I'm going to implement some of this at HKU. So everything is going to be student-led. I give responsibility to the students. So there's no more these books with problematic findings. We focus on recent, up-to-date articles, preferably by things that we've verified together, me and the students, recent meta-analysis, recent evidence, register reports, and large samples around the world. There's no instructor truth. I need a lot of humility. Everything is discussion-based. So it brings a little bit of how we do typically the most postgraduate or PhD seminars into the undergraduate training. What is the most important is that I really wanted undergraduates to have the experience of performing actual science and being part of the scientific process, doing peer review and receiving peer review, and using the latest tools and trends in psychological science, pre-registrations, register reports, and so forth. The principles are complete transparency, so everybody that comes into my courses knows that everything is open science. Everything is shared, aside from their grade. Everything that they do is going to be open on Google Docs for the entire community. Everything that we do is later shared on the Open Science Framework. And then we emphasize rigor and accuracy rather than novelty and simplicity over complexity in order to try and drive to some conclusions that they can process. So rather than trying to overwhelm them with information, we try to include them and help them to get to a conclusion with a collaborative effort and very little to no hierarchy. Everything that I do is shared. So you can see open science is not just about my research, but also about my teaching and education. So everything starting pandemic, one of the few rare good things that happen about this pandemic is that it forced me to do everything on Zoom and record. So you can go and find all that I do on Open Science Framework and on YouTube. And that was also helpful in getting to audiences that I normally did not get a chance to. So if you want to see some of what we do, you want to see the class interaction, you can just go and see this on YouTube. One amazing thing that came out from this whole collaboration, aside from the scientific impact, is that we created collaborative guides and templates. So you can actually, with your students and in your courses and in your labs, take everything that we've done and implement this. Plus, you can also help us to improve what it is that we do. So all of these are Google Docs, starting from how to calculate effect size and confidence intervals, how to do a power analysis, what are the best practices for statistical methods, how to run Qualtrics, how to run things on online labor markets, Jamovi, JASP, R. If I would do this on my own, this would be a very brief 5 to 10 pages, but some of these are hundreds of pages long, verified, edited by each other. So both the students, the teaching assistants, and the entire community helps us to do better. And we do some fairly innovative things in this problem-based learning system where they work as teams. So they have a team contract and they have a team report. And there's all sorts of things that you can just go and see if you would like to use that in your courses. Plus, if you want to see what the students are capable of, this is remarkable. It's nothing short of outstanding. So everything that the students did is shared with the community. How do we do the science projects? So first 2 years, we did everything, including data collection within one semester. So from the beginning of them not having any experience with methods or statistics coming into the course, within one semester, they have an APA-style submission-ready manuscript with data collection all analyzed. And that is a bit rushed and has all sorts of disadvantages, but the students have done an amazing work. In the last 2 years, we moved into a registered report stage 1 model where we aim to submit to the journal the pre-registration plan prior to any data collection. And what we do over there, rather than having real data, we simulate data sets, and then the students do their planned data analysis, their statistical methods on the simulated data sets. So it's just a better scientific process and part of the scientific reform movement. This is a bit of the process of how it's done. So it involves them setting up in a Qualtrics then writing based on our templates, the introduction, and doing some analysis of the phenomenon, and then generating the data set for the analysis, and then writing the full introduction methods and the results. As you can see here, we have peer review, both internal and external. So we have two teams of two students working independently. And then once they have some kind of output, they peer review one another. So they give feedback based on their own experience. It really helps to see others' work coming from your own perspective. Plus, I go on Twitter, I go to the academic community and say, my students are working on this. Here's the Google Doc. Do you want to come and contribute? And to our great surprise, a lot of professors and Eureka researchers come in and provide comments to the undergraduates in their Google Docs. We do some pre-testing, and finally, they write up the registered report final submission. If there's data involved in the first 2 years, there was like a 2 weeks or 3 weeks a year in a semester that I didn't sleep very much, conducting all the data collection for the 10 to 15 projects. And then finally, once again, two teams working on the data collection, peer reviewing one another, and then opening this up for peer review on Twitter. Then finally, we could ideally submit these to journals, but we don't. This is when, after the semester is over, I go on Twitter and say, this is what the students have done. Who wants to help us take this to journal submission? And this is where early career researchers, even you, if you're interested, regardless of what happens with me, you can come in and take part. So we have about 30 of these completed with data collection. We have about 30 of these registered reports that you can decide if you want to become the lead author on that. Starting from last year, all of the thesis students that work with me, last year was 9, all of them submit to journals as part of their 1-year thesis work in something called Peer Community and Registered Report, which is absolutely revolutionary in many respects. It guarantees peer review within 2 weeks, which is the main thing that has allowed me to embed this within the thesis work. And you can see my involvement in how we do this and how we get the peer review from peer community and register reports. And finally, before we conduct the data collection, all of the thesis work received an in-principle acceptance from journals. Just to show you what that looks like in terms of impact. So you can see the general publication structure. So this has had an impact in 2021. So you can see all the underlined are undergraduate students, followed by teaching assistants, and then me trailing at the back. And the first authors are these invited early career researchers, and they are shared co-author, first co-author with the students. So everything is detailed, everything is shared responsibility and credit. We detail very clearly what the students have done, what the teaching assistants have done, and what the lead authors have done. But once you have this kind of collaborative effort, you can really have an impact. And you can see that we've been able to get this to some surprising journals. At the beginning, I was a bit skeptical on, but Judgment Decision Making, Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, and even some economics journal, Journal of Economic Psychology. So I was surprised to see how receptive some of these journals have been. This year is likely to be as impactful, so it keeps on going and growing every year. Plus, this year, because of what I've been doing with my students, this peer community and registered reports, all of my thesis students have received in-principle acceptance. So that means that it's a guaranteed publication in Collabra. Plus, in addition to this, about 9 early career researchers working based on the things that were done in my class on a registered report, stage 1, with an invitation to revise and resubmit. So this brings me to the latest development, and with this I'm going to wrap up. Following the pandemic, I had a lot of time to sit with myself and think. I've had a lot of quarantines coming back to Hong Kong. So I realized that I really want to not just have an impact on the scientific community in terms of research methods and open science, and on my students in terms of teaching, but I want us to try and have some impact on the world, a little bit like what's happening with the Psychological Science Accelerator. So I decided to revamp my courses yet again, endorsing the slogan of trying to do more good and doing good better, and using the best methods of psychological science in order to address issues of morality, responsibility, how to help and give, how to assess risks and benefits, how to increase well-being and decrease suffering, and how to help people understand how to do a cost calculation of effectiveness. This is part of a trend that's happening right now in social psychology and cognitive sciences. So effective altruism is a movement that tries to use scientific methods in order to understand how to do altruism better. So rather than trusting charities that they will do, Red Cross, contribute to Red Cross. Why Red Cross? What have they done? What kind of level of transparency? How do I know that this is effective? So if we don't have a level of transparency, if we do everything based on gut reaction, then all of the things that we study as cognitive biases can also be applied to the way that we do altruism. And there is a way of overcoming these in order to make these more effective. So a group of scholars, most of them early career researchers, have been dedicating more and more efforts into this. And now I try to embed myself within this literature, the psychology of effective altruism and how to overcome obstacles to effective giving. And in my own team, I've been trying to do more and more on that. So for example, how to do altruism, what is morality? So how do people think about charitable giving? So the identifiable victim effect, that people contribute more to an identifiable single victim rather than unidentified statistical victims as a group, is one of the classic findings. So does this replicate? To what extent? How can we overcome this? What are kind of the interventions that we can do to de-bias? Just as one example, we just completed and published this omission bias meta-analysis where we reviewed the literature. Omission bias originally in the 1980s was about Americans' decisions not to vaccinate their kids against various diseases because they were more afraid of the harm of side effects rather than the dangers of not vaccinating their children. So there's something about taking action and vaccinating your kid that seems to hold a more direct link to having more responsibility than if I don't vaccinate my kid and the kid is sick, then it's not my responsibility. The world has caused this. So there is something about taking action that leads to stronger perceptions of intent, causality, responsibility, accountability. So we wanted to map this out, especially relevant in the context of the pandemic. We were very surprised just how little work there is on this. So we identify a lot of directions for future research. And I think this is applicable not just to pandemics, but also to climate change and other kinds of decisions when it comes to why do we help? When do we decide not to help? When do we stick to the status quo, instead of taking action? And this also ties to some of my other work that I will just briefly touch on here, that I study values, morality, and ethics. So I here again use very large samples or meta-analysis in order to see what is the link between the various circumflex. Some of this is about benevolence and pro-sociality, and some of the things like unethical behavior or moral foundations, dark triad, and the big five. So mapping out what leads certain people or certain contexts to get people to help more or emphasize benevolence and universalism values. So bringing all this together with cognitive biases in order to just trying to map out and do some good in the world. This year, also the students are doing work on this, hands-on work on this. So just yesterday, they submitted some of the books that they wrote. So you can go and have a look at the books, 200 and something pages on how to leverage psychological science in order to support more effective altruism, how to use things that we've learned from psychological science about influence, persuasion, and behavioral change in order to do some good in the world. So I wasn't sure if this is going to work out or not, but everything that we've tried this semester was brilliant. We also implemented in the classroom giving games, so getting students with real money that they can contribute to certain charities. How do we emphasize whether do we want to devote this to climate change, taking carbon from the environment, or maybe emphasizing animal care, or perhaps getting people, incentivizing people to do vaccinations. So they take part in these giving games, and then finally, in their name, we donate real money to these charities. But it gets them to contemplate how to be effective, how to use psychological science in order to make the best decision. So this brings me to the summary of everything together. On the one side, we have the approach of large team science, big team science, collaborative science, open science, meta science, and then implementing this on my various domains, judgment, decision-making, morality, ethics, and values. Every time I try something new, I see if that works out. I build based on this, start small, build up, and integrate my research directions with the education that I do, and then the community, the academic community and beyond, in order to try and have the most impact. If you want any more information about everything here, all that I do is openly shared. All the materials, all the teaching and the research is on my website. If you want to reach out to me directly, this is my email. We also have updates every 2 months on the activities of the team, so you can sign up for the mailing list. So that's all from me for now. Thank you.
Yeah, I have some past experience with large-scale historical collaborations, though nothing on the same scale as what you're doing. So it certainly resonated. But one question I had is, given this, what looks like a vast number of replications that you've done with this approach in the last few years, I was wondering if you could actually comment in very general terms on the outcomes of all of these replications. I know social psych, I know there's been a lot of controversy in the last few years, people referring to a replication crisis and so forth. And so I guess in light of having done all these replications, what's your take? How well are sort of the classics standing up versus sort of not standing up, or and so forth? Could you comment a bit on that, please?
Yes, thank you. That's a good question. I should first say that in 2016, 17, when I was trying to decide, so now I'm a postdoc, what am I going to build my research on? I needed to, based on my gut intuition, make a decision of what to do. And although I've done some things in judgment decision making, this was not my main area of research. And I decided to put everything aside, to pause this for a bit and focus on judgment decision making. The reason for that was because my gut untested intuition was that judgment and decision making, behavioral economics, based on the work of Kahneman and Tversky, seems to me the most solid. Based on when I taught these things in the classroom, it was very easy to demonstrate, even if the sample is small in the classroom, uncontrolled, demonstrating these things live. So demonstrating positive, negative framing is easy to show. Demonstrating action in action effects is easy to show. But I didn't have a good systematic way of approaching this, which is why I felt it's very important for me to do this mass scale collaboration in order to revisit these using best practices, scientific methods. I should say that based on our results so far, first, you're right. Social psychology right now, the record seems to be, and I've been tracking this for a very long time, is that about 30 to 50% of the things replicate. And in the things that replicate, the effect size seems to be about half of what is published, which is very disappointing. We'll know to what extent this represents the larger literature when DARPA SCORE next year comes out with their very systematic replications of not just psychology, but also economics, sociology, and beyond. But to me, that was very disappointing, and I was hoping for more of that. I am happy to report that at least from my sampled bias, so I did not use random sampling of the literature like DARPA SCORE did. I chose the classics, and I chose this based on impact, dating all the way back to Kahneman and Tversky. Our replication success rate is about 70%. With 15 that are mixed and inconclusive, and 15 that are failed. Even in the inconclusive and the failed ones, we were able to identify a way forward. So at least with my view of judgment decision-making, the gut instinct that I had back then seems to hold, at least for the chosen classics that I focused on. There is a lot to be said about judgment and decision making, at least the ones that I chose to replicate, are the simplest ones. So they are the ones that had all the scenarios laid out. They had usually a main effect, perhaps an interaction. So the most simplified methods. So at least those foundations seem to be solid. And it's not just, I want to just emphasize, use this opportunity to say, it's not just the judgment and decision-making literature that we've tried to replicate seems to have higher replicability rate, and that we were able to identify ways forward even in the failed ones. But I want you to take a moment and think about the implications of what it means that we were able to do this in our team using undergraduates in Hong Kong. Because when I started in 2018, and I reached out to the original authors and said, I am a first-year assistant professor at University of Hong Kong, looking to replicate your work using undergraduate students in my courses on labor markets, on Mechanical Turk and Prolific. Can you please help us? A lot of the reactions were pretty skeptical, to the point of almost being hostile. It's like, even if this replicate, it's not likely that you will be able to gain these kinds of insights. So it's not only that the judgment and decision-making classics that we've selected seem to hold pretty well, it seems also that we are able to demonstrate convincingly as a proof of concept that students are able to do these very well. So I try to look at this together. In addition to this, based on the insights, the meta-scientific insights that we have in judgment decision-making, our templates, our guides, we are also involved in the attempt to at least map out systematically in social psychology and beyond what works and what doesn't work. And I very briefly mentioned prediction markets. So rather than us having to really replicate everything, being able to predict in advance using machine learning and some prediction markets using paying people in order to make accurate predictions in advance to see what works and what doesn't work. And it seems like, and I think this is pretty obvious to us now, it wasn't a decade ago, that if you have large samples, if you have less of a publication bias, if you have all sorts of different factors like transparency, then there's higher likelihood of replication. If the p-values are not just below 0.05, but are much more convincing than that, lower than that, effect sizes seem to be reasonable and not unimaginable, then that seems to hold better. So we're slowly identifying through our collaboration, through DARPA SCORE, through all these mass collaborations, being able to identify, even if we don't replicate something, what is the likelihood that this is going to hold or not? It's not 100%, but at least it gives us some way of moving forward looking at the literature.
Thanks very much.
Can I just ask a question, just quick follow-up question about the cameras? Because now, like, there's different kinds of like not being able to replicate, right? So one could be, start from the original materials, and then the coding could be different. So unless you do the same coding by yourself, and then maybe you don't get the same coded results to coded data to start with the analysis. So this is the first step, and then second step is like based on the coded data, and that was measured the data, and then you try to replicate the theoretical part, right, the analysis part, but then maybe a minor degree of error would produce a vastly different outcome in the end. So that is like another, like the natures of unreplicabilities, right? And then finally, it's like maybe this is something different, like it's like maybe the coding data has something wrong, like there's some manipulation there. So like how do you like to distinguish these different kinds of issues with different natures, but then produce the same problems of like not being able to replicate it? Yeah.
Yes, that's a very important insight. And I think it's some of the things that we've been tackling in the last decade. When I did my PhD, I just assumed that science has figured this out, that science knows how to define whether a replication is successful, that science knows how to reproduce and replicate. And I was very surprised to see that first of all, we don't even do, let's put aside replications, we don't even do reproductions because we don't share anything. I think coming into a PhD program and realizing that scholars don't share, we get funded by the taxpayers, They pay our salaries and our funding, but we don't share it back with the community. We hold this as if this is our own. So we don't share, so we don't even have a way of doing a reproduction of the materials. We don't have a way of reanalyzing the data. So some of the things that the science reform movement has been trying to promote is to get people to share more. If everybody kept their data for themselves regarding vaccines or about mapping the genome and all that, then we wouldn't be able to achieve some of the science advances. So the first part has to be about how much we share and to what extent, and whether we are able to identify how the scientists have arrived at their conclusions. So everything that we do is completely shared with the materials, the data, and the code, and we're trying to turn this into the default so that at the very least, others can try and reproduce and replicate our work. So if we do a replication, a reproduction or a replication of something from the 1970s that hasn't been shared, at least they can come in and take our materials and check our data and our code. Now, there's all sorts of different things that can happen. And we do a lot of this. I didn't have time to go into this in great detail, but I also do science assessments. And we also apply red teams. So if you go on my website, for example, there's a section called Check Me, Replicate Me, where I invite others to check my work and replicate my work. And I also offer monetary incentives. So if you find a minor error in my work, $5 US, a major error, $50 US. And I also invite the students to attack my science with the previous students, and students are able to identify these kinds of mistakes. And we apply this red team assessment methodology on our own science and some of the science that is out there. And some of the things that we do has led to us identifying a misalignment between the text, the figures, and the tables. And some of the work that was done by the students has led to expression of concern by some of the original authors and journals like Psychological Science. So having things open, and if they're not open, trying best we can to reproduce those in order to identify whether there's some issues. Like for me, it's unimaginable that something from the 1980s has never been looked at, and undergraduate at HKU are the first ones in 40 years to identify statistical errors. So if they can do this, us as a community, we should have done this a long time ago. Then there's the issue of, can we reproduce what has been done? So we tend to look at published findings from the 1970s and 80s and said this was done once by samples of 40 participants in Princeton. Therefore, it should be communicated in TED Talks. Therefore, it's in a book. We don't need to replicate this. We don't need to run this again and again. And then it's not surprising that some of these things do not replicate. It could be that time has passed. 40 years, we don't know if perhaps this was not a false positive, perhaps this was a real phenomenon, but it's no longer relevant. It could be that Princeton students are not like Hong Kong citizens. It could be something about the method is different. So at the very least, we're trying to make things as open and transparent as possible so that everybody can build on our work. So for example, there is a team, part of our team in Brazil, that is taking everything that we do and just translating this to Portuguese and running this with Brazilian samples. So we need to make this mainstream. Replications should be mainstream because they are the core of the scientific process. Only through that can we identify some issues, some misalignments, some contextual, perhaps some updates in time where things are weaker or stronger. We actually don't know. But unless we do these replications, unless we make everything open, unless we do assessments and invite others to check and attack our research, only with all of that can we really be confident when we talk to students, when we talk to participants, when we communicate things to the public. Only then can we really have the confidence that these things hold. So replications and reproductions aim to address that. I just want to add one last thing, is that we don't just do replications. We do replications and extensions. And I think this is really important because it's not that we don't do novel research. We do a lot of novel research, but it's done systematically so that if you do a novel research and that fails, you want to know, is it because I've done something novel, or is it because what I've based my research on does not work? So replication and extension allows you to say, perhaps it could be that the original phenomenon in the literature that I have not built, so that I've built my research on, does not hold as well. So if only the extension doesn't work, but the replication holds, the community learns something new, you learn something new, perhaps you need to adjust your extension. If the replication also fails, perhaps you need to go a step backwards and rethink what it is that you've looked at in the literature. So doing things systematically, mapping everything out, starting from reproductions to replications and then adding extensions allows you to very carefully be able to know that what you're standing on are solid foundations.
I think this is great. And so you are in a very unique position to have, I think probably more than anyone else I've talked to, talk about what is the effect of like doing the same thing over and over again and like minor variations. And so I was wondering, outside of the registered reports, in trying to do maybe pre-registered replications or meta-analyses, have you, what is your sense of publication bias against like null findings?
Yeah,
is it still like incredibly difficult to, get a really well-designed study, but that ultimately leads to a null finding? Is it still really difficult to get those published?
Yes, good question. And this is a question that I think a lot about because almost every week I get rejection. We have so many manuscripts by now that I've seen decision letters and reviewers of like one of the things that we actually do in a meta science. I have mentioned meta science. So we're applying scientific principles to the process of science. One of those things is that we code decision letters. Why are we getting rejected? Are we getting rejected because there's perhaps a certain bias against null findings, biased against replications? It seems like so in terms of replications, there's a bias regardless of what the results are. If the results are that you successful replication, people are saying this is not surprising. So you were able to replicate something from, Princeton University has 2,000 citations. Why is this important? If it's failed, it's like, of course, you failed because you're not from these Ivy League schools or because of these factors and that factors. So it is important that because our peer review is not open and transparent, because it is essentially a trust system where we trust the for-profit publishers to do the work for us based on, so we never get access to what happens in the peer review process. It is very important to try and overcome some of these. And I think I never imagined for myself to be in this kind of position, but I have hundreds of these kind of decision letters to see what is happening. And I can say from my personal experiences that it's very frustrating because there is a very strong bias, especially from what we tend to emphasize high impact factor journals, where even if they endorse things like register reports, they do this to a very limited, specific extent. The things that they emphasize on are things that are newsworthy or citation worthy, and that has all sorts of implications. The way that we review things, aside from not knowing what reviewers are doing, the emphasis seems to be less on methods than and more on theory. Like, when is the last time I always share the data in the code. It's very rare for a reviewer to actually go through it. We don't even run this. Nobody actually runs this thing. No, we look at things that we think might be red flags, but other than that, I think on average, people dedicate 2-3 hours for a review. I dedicate 2 days for a review because I want to see that everything is as reported. I want to see that everything is transparent, to see that if there's an error that we can find it. So there's lots of biases. Actually, part of our research is trying to look at cognitive biases, not just in the population about pandemic, global warming, and morality, but also about how researchers do research. So we researchers have a lot of hindsight bias, outcome bias, confirmation bias. We are as biased as everybody else, if not more than that. I give talks showing that Daniel Kahneman has done some of these things and has admitted with humility that being an expert on cognitive biases does not mean that you're not biased. So if we have insights to share with the academic community and beyond, we can definitely turn this on to ourselves and saying, knowing that we have outcome bias, hindsight bias, what should we do better in the process? And some of this has to do with overcoming publication bias when it comes to null findings. So registered reports are the way to address this. If you don't want to do registered reports, at least mask the results so that the reviewers don't know this. And if you do a review, share the review so that we know if the reviewer used the outcome as kind of a sign of whether the quality was high or low. And then we can assess that review. So we need to also do reviews of reviewers, and we don't do this as much. The reason why I decided to do peer community in registered reports, a lot of revolutionary things about this. It's not just that it's a registered report. It's not just that peer review is done within 2 weeks, but all of the peer review is open. Everything can be assessed very transparently. Everything is positive and constructive. You arrive at a conclusion together. And then one of the other things that is revolutionary is shifting the power from these for-profit publishers to the community, where the community guarantees or gives a certification of the quality, and then the author chooses from 20, 30, 40 different journals where they want to publish. So for the first time in my life, after we received in-principle acceptance, suddenly the editor of Collabra Psychology contacts me and says, we saw that you received an in-principle acceptance. Would you be willing to consider Collabra? So if, for example, they have fees for open access, you can say, I'm very happy to publish with you if you waive the fees, because these are students and early career researchers. So with Collabra, we waived the fees for all of these. So this really gives the power back to authors. This is science done right, with all the peer review open. Everything is transparent. Everything is verifiable, so that when we say something to the community, and anybody, including the public, can go and assess our research, see the peer review, and see if the conclusions are warranted or not.
Thank you, Dr. Feldman, for the very educational talk to me. So I'm a developmental psychologist, so I'm quite familiar with Many Babies project. And I'm also an advocate for open science. This has been talked extensively in our field as well. So my observation in our field is a lot of, there's quite encouragement for replication studies, for developmental studies, because usually a lot of studies in the past has a very small sample size and conducted in a very strict lab using a very specific procedures. So a replication in a different population, in a different lab, or even in a field setting is really important to see the generalizability of the findings. But my observation from this is a lot of studies, especially replication studies, were done in labs with a lot of resources, which large facilities, which a lot of grad students who has the time and the resource to conduct replications. So because, for example, I study babies, a lot of studies were like, if I do this replication study, I may lose those participants for another study, which is more, it's something new that I want to explore. So my question is more like, I want to have your thoughts or suggestions for early career researcher like me. How should I balance, having some replications and also having the, room for promoting new ideas in my own kind of research program?
Yeah, thank you for that. Excellent. First, I'm glad that you're involved in this, and I wish more developmental, educational psychologists would take part in this. I think Many Babies is revolutionary. I think especially developmental, and in our department, neuroscience, sometimes you have samples of 10, 20 published findings. And especially in neuro, has a lot of noise. Babies are noisy. If adults are noisy, then babies are even more noisy. It's very difficult. And a lot of time experimenters bring their own attitude when they're dealing with the babies, and experimenters where they're analyzing the neuro, the outputs of that. So the more noise that you have, the smaller the samples, the larger the challenge. And that makes it very difficult for early career researchers and students to have an impact. And I think two things that I mentioned are the solution to this. First is those large-scale collaborations. So being involved in something like Many Babies, with all its limitations about bureaucracy and speed, is perhaps a good way for you to proceed and make sure that you both have the publications and have more solid findings. But then I think there's expectations for you to be a lead author and then take some initiative and show your own research. And I think this is where it's especially important, and it's undervalued how much contribution registered reports have. So I want to just emphasize the aspect of what is a registered report, even though I understand that many of you are familiar with this. A registered report is that you submit a pre-registration plan to the journal. You conduct peer review on that. And once you, the editor, and the reviewers agree that this is the best plan, then the journal gives you an in-principle acceptance. What is amazing about this is that this is a guaranteed publication. So it could be that you are, without any resources, you just have an amazing plan. You have a great research design, but you don't have the ability to execute this. Having an in-principle acceptance actually means you go to the Hong Kong government, or you go to HKUST, or you go on the world with Twitter or whatever and say, I am the lead author on this registered report and it's guaranteed to be published. Who wants to join me? I don't have enough babies. I don't have enough resources. Who wants to join? And then establish a co-authorship model just like we did. And then others, let's say you don't want to do the data collection or you want to distribute your data collection, others can join you on this co-authorship. And then their motivation is clear. You've already guaranteed the publication. And you don't have to worry about not having enough resources. Plus, for the granting authorities, for the university, for the Hong Kong government, there's no risk involved because this is already, it's going to be published. So rather than funding something that has a, I don't know, 10 to 20% chance of getting published at the end, they already know that this is going to be used for good. So you can, based on that plan, go and seek out funding. And I know from experience, even with my university that at the beginning was very skeptical about registered reports and generally working with undergraduates, it's now that we have the registered report model, the university is very glad they awarded me a grant that gives, if a student co-authored manuscript has an in-principle acceptance from a journal, then they would give for data collection up to 8,000 Hong Kong dollars. And I'm hoping this is a proof of concept, and it works extremely well, that once we have this, then at HKU or HKUST or various places in Hong Kong, we can scale this up to the point of registered reports is already the best way for us to do science. It's also the least risky for early career researchers and for granting authorities. It's a win-win for everybody. In terms of the replications, I would say that at the very least, I would suggest to build your foundations on things that are credible. So it's important to come to the literature with humility, with a critical mindset, and see if this was done on 5-10 babies in the 1970s, what is the likelihood that this is going to work for me now here in Hong Kong using my sample? And the answer is probably not very likely. Could be. There's some kind of likelihood, but if we understand science well, then this is not very probable. So looking at what the Many Babies projects did and some of the registered reports that are increasingly coming out of developmental educational psychology and building your things on that and then endorsing, it's great that you want to do a novel work, but at the very least, do this as a replication and extension. Whereas the first step, you validate what it is that you think is expected to happen, and you add your novel contributions on top of that. Another thing that you can do, which is also what we do, is to conduct a meta-analysis of the literature to see, is there a problem of too small samples? Is there a problem of publication bias? So now we have the methods in order to try and assess this, in order to see if If the literature seems solid, if a lot of meta-analysis does not indicate a publication bias, if this has been done by hundreds of labs, then this is a much better starting point than a single article has done something in the 1970s. So I try and train my collaborators and my students and myself to seek out credible evidence. And then if I do novel research, to build on top of that rather than other things that I am skeptical or not sure about.
Kevin, yeah.
Hi, may I ask a quick question? I suppose most of the work that you discussed today under these different teams or projects are kind of quantitative works, right? I'm just wondering to what extent these things that you discussed, the principles behind, are applicable also to qualitative research, or put it differently, whether qualitative research can also benefit from this kind of endeavors.
Yes, that's a good question. I can only say as an external observer, because I do not personally do qualitative research, but I follow the Twitter sphere. Now it's a Mastodon after the mass migration. There are people who are on top of this. So at the beginning, people were saying, you can do register reports for confirmatory future research, but if you have a data archive, how can you do pre-registration on that? It already exists. How can you do a register report on that? And then the qualitative people are like, we're not really sure how this translates exactly to what it is that we do. And there's many disciplines that have different kinds of methodologies that they apply in their own scientific fields that don't seem to, at least at the beginning, to translate very well. But the nice thing about the science reform movement folks is that they are very solution-oriented. So whenever they are faced with a challenge, they come together to try and come up with solutions starting from a template. So now there is a pre-registration template for qualitative research. Peer community in registered reports and other registered report supportive journals are accepting qualitative registered reports. So there is a way to do this. The fine details of what happens over there, I am not familiar with, but they have, at least in peer community, what is called a level of control over bias. So they have 6 different levels. The highest is 6, confirmatory, everything shared, haven't seen the data and all of that. But if the data exists, or the methods are a little bit different, the quantification of that is, they have statistical methods, but you have some other way, then you reduce the level of control in order to make sure that it's transparent what kind of things you can draw from that. Qualitative research is still being figured out, but there are already some initial solutions that come within a form of a template, some examples of published research, and registered reports that are adapting to qualitative research. Whatever question you have about how to implement, it's terrific, because I think it really challenges us in the science reform. I suggest raising this up, and then within a year or two, I think we'll be able to come up with a solution. And just give one last example. A lot of people are very worried about sharing because they say, we got this from a company and the company doesn't allow for this to share, or there's some identified information and we can't share that. So that was raised 2-3 years ago, and we now have synthetic data sets where you create a data set that has all the statistical factors that are in the original one. Then we have a third party that can verify that these two seem similar. And then you share the synthetic data set instead of your own. So whatever the issue is, whatever the challenge, even things that seem to be unsolvable, the science reform movement and this open science collaboration seems to come up with some solutions. So if there's something specific about your context that you're worried about, you can contact me or some of the others in the science reform movement to see what we can do about this. We meet 2-3 times a year. We sit together in round tables or on Zoom and Google Docs, and we work on actual solutions. So if there's something specific about your context that you're not sure about, raise this, write to me or some of the others in the team, and we'd be happy to raise this and see how we can come up with a solution.
Hi, Philly, Michelle.
Hi.
Good morning. Good morning. Interesting talk. So given like the the sort of the network that you have or things you've been working on about COVID and human nature in general. So can you tell me what do we know about the humans, or what do you know about the humans?
Okay, so that's so I give entire semesters on this discussing this sort of thing. I can only tell you my view based on my understanding of the literature. And I will use this opportunity to also discuss the issues with replications and open science. Recently, like two years ago, during the pandemic, when I was hiking in Hong Kong, I was listening to a book called Humankind, an optimistic view of, and what was amazing about this book is that the book almost one by one, chapter by chapter, referred to the things that I've been teaching undergraduates at HKU for the 2 years before that, which is some of our basic understanding of human nature as reflected in the social psychology literature. For example, Stanford experiment, which is not really an experiment. There's lots of flaws in there. There's all sorts of issues that came out of that. The bystander effect, where people don't intervene if there's large number of people around. All sorts of things in the literature just don't seem to replicate. And if we look at credible evidence from the recent years about all sorts of mass scale collaboration on the bystander effect, on lost wallets around the world, things regarding human nature that try and tap into are we inherently bad, seems to suggest that at the very least things are much more complex than initially thought. And if we look at cooperation over time, the literature, how we as a species are doing, if we look at the grand view over time, then it seems like people are much more inclined in their nature to be social animals, to cooperate, to coordinate. However, there are some limits to that, and that reflects cognitive biases. So unfortunately, one of the things that replicates very well is the Milgram experiment. We have a tendency to divide in-group and out-group, preference for the in-group over the out-group. We do have a tendency to follow commands if they come from an authority. There's also the insights in the literature that are solid, that show our limitations. So even if by nature we can take a more optimistic view, it seems to be limited by some of the things. And then our role, I think, is, and this is some of the things that we try to do with effective altruism, with the mapping out cognitive biases, is to help people to overcome that in order to bring out the good and minimize to the extent that we can some of the negative aspects to that. But overall, to sum all this up, is that I'm generally optimistic about human nature. I am constantly being tested on this every day I open the news. But generally taking the long-term perspective, I think in the back you can see the book Factfulness, looking at trends, looking at real data, looking at the aggregation of the best data that we have. There's no other time that I would have preferred to be born in. This is what other time in the world do we have such scientific advances, such collaboration around the world? So generally, I am an optimist.
Okay. Now, something related to your huge group of collaborators. I'm toying with 60 of them. They are driving me crazy or nuts. Whenever you're dealing with people, it's complicated, right? But it sounds like, wow, you dance with them really, really well, right? So, I mean, that isn't, well, I mean, we usually present the best side of human nature whatsoever, right? Now, the question I have is like, you have a large network, you've been collecting, or you guys have been collecting data whatsoever, right? How do you control the data quality? How do you oversee? It's good to have different data sharing, etc. But what's the texture of the data? Are they good? In terms of different part of the world, different languages, and different standards. How do you deal with the data quality issue?
Great question. There's two sides to this. One is the mass scale collaborations that I am part of, where I do not manage it. And over there, I agree that this is an issue. The way that we typically try and address this issue is to share everything and open this up for assessment and red teams. This is how they manage it. When it comes to me, I am very worried about all these aspects. So when it comes to the team that I coordinate, I am the only person who conducts, at least for the replications done in Hong Kong in my lab, which is most of them so far. There's the other teams in Brazil, France, and all that. But the things that I coordinate, that I'm the corresponding author on, I conducted the data collection. We do all of these on online labor markets. So we use Amazon Mechanical Turk on the platform of cloud research, and then we use Prolific and some of these other ones. And there's lots of checks and balances in order to reduce error as much as possible. So this was a major concern to me. For all my thesis students, for all the people in my courses, I don't want students to even have to worry about this. I don't want for me to have any concern about data quality. So at least all the data collections I am doing following pre-registration or register report in principle acceptance, where others have looked at my Qualtrics and have made sure that everything is solid. Plus we have so many checks and balances. So 2 teams working independently, peer reviewing each other, teaching assistants, external reviewers, and then now we have all these teams. So they help me do well in that. In terms of the analysis, is that following all these checks and balances, at the end, we have this early career researcher who takes the lead, who verifies all of that. And we try and aim at journals that really care about open, trustworthy peer review, where somebody would look at all that we've done. Plus, every year, my students look at the outputs from previous years. So they do assessments and they try to attack this and find all kinds of flaws. And at the end of it, we also open and share everything. So we already know that we are flawed, where we have weaknesses. So even our best efforts, sometimes some things slip through. But I built this process in a way that would minimize mistakes and reliances on others. In terms of how to coordinate this effort, I think I have a lot of recommendations. I give a 3-hour workshop on this, but I'll summarize this as aligning expectations, like well in advance. So you can go and see our Google Doc about how to join us. Everything is laid out. Every time I learn something new or there's a new challenge, I add this to the Google Doc. So it's not like I have to reinvent everything from the beginning. You can take our guide or some of the other collaboration guides. By now, in order to join, you need to accept all of that. First, you need to read. There's a certain assessment to make sure that you know what you're signing into. And then what happens when there are issues of, disagreements? So what happens when there's, happens with early career researchers a lot, that they're dropped out of the system. They don't get into a PhD or postdoc, or some people disappear. Pandemic was very challenging because people went through all sorts of really bad things. And I can't blame anybody for this. So trying to be as inclusive as possible in advance, doing sort of like a mini contract just to align expectations. And then for each case study that comes up, writing what you think the end result should be for us to resolve this. That's very briefly my approach to this.
I mean, great. I mean, there's so much we can do, but then, I'm on the one hand, I'm very happy you initiated such a big thing, sharing everything or whatever. But on the other hand, I'll be worrying because you have such a big network. And then you collected the data and the results, it's replicated. There are so many people, and people will say, oh, that is it. It's a revolution. What we found before could be a hiccup or a mistake or whatsoever. And that was why I was asking, what is the fundamentals? For example, translation of questionnaire or how they did, because I'm sure, whenever we're dealing with cross-cultural research, we know that different people in different places have different standards. So that's what I'm not like, if I'm a single case study or single studies, you still, it needs to be replicated or whatsoever. But because you did all the background work and people will say, okay, from that group, that is it, but then, what about the fundamental, the translation? And that's how I brought up the thing, I don't have a solution either. All right. Thank you.
Just quickly it seems like judgment and decision making is very amenable to online labor markets, and maybe something like survey experiments, like those kind of results. But are there any areas that you haven't been working on yet that you could see extending this to easily, and where there might be challenges? Like the method you've set up with your student collaborations, and then doing most of the work on online labor markets. I'm imagining that doesn't work for a variety of fields.
Yes, I started simple and extended in very small steps in order to see what's possible. So, for example, I started from very easy vignette manipulations. So having a scenario, changing one factor, or having a choice set and changing one factor, for example, setting a default, or having a different description. And these things seem to hold pretty well. Where things get a bit complicated with labor markets, and there's lots of limitations to labor markets. There's lots of discussions about data quality. It took us a bit of time to overcome many of those. So now we know how to do this well, how to do comprehension checks, attention checks, use cloud research, approve participants, overcome all the, not bots, but automated responding and some of these challenges. These are motivated by trying to conclude your task as fast as possible while maintaining quality. So they take pride in their work, being full-time online labor market participants, but they do have an incentive of trying to get through these as much as possible. So for example, one of the challenges was writing tasks. So there's lots of recall tasks or things that require them to contemplate, and at the beginning, I saw all kinds of attempts. Maybe we do timers, or maybe we try to do this, we try to do that. At the end, I would say that they're very writing averse. And there's a few tricks that we've done in order to try and overcome this. But the more that you involve open-ended kind of codifiable sorts of questionnaires, then you're going to have more noise and reduce the data quality. So definitely there's some limitations for the things that you can run. I am very fortunate with judgment decision making and social psychology that I can run. There's no shortage of classics that employ my kinds of methods. But I can also say that some of the journals, so for example, I've tried many times to get to psychological science. They even have a section for pre-registered replications. They would not take vignette studies from judgment decision making. We've tried like almost 10 times. It doesn't matter that it was published in psychological science or that it has 2,000 citations. They want to see real behavior. But I do know, and we're increasingly trying to move to that, to doing not just Qualtrics surveys, but using O-tree and multiple collaborators, game theory kind of experiments. And I think as long as behavior is coordinated and well codified, I think it's possible with online labor markets. But the more that you get into contemplation, deliberation, writing, it's going to be tricky to implement this kind of methods. But the Psychological Science Accelerator and some of these other teams have been doing that rather well. I'm actually surprised by the level of success that they have, and they have all sorts of methods in place in order to try and do this. So they don't use online labor markets, they use participants. Sometimes they have funding to pay them and motivate them in some other ways. So there are some solutions, but I try to focus on the things that are doable for me to do quickly, efficiently, with students, minimizing errors and maximizing impact. I'm hoping that moving to more like O-tree experimental methodology of game theory paradigms and multiple participants I think this is the furthest extent that we can take what it is that we do is going to be sufficient in order for us to gain some insight. And we will need to complement this with lab and field studies. So this is one of the planned next steps. And I think now that we have the team established and we work well together and we trust one another, that we're able to try at least a proof of concept of doing the next step in doing something that's a bit more complicated than vignette on labor markets.